Mr. Clerk. First item of business is to call roll. Everyone present, please indicate your presence with the electronic voting board. Okay. We have a quorum. We have one housekeeping matter to take care of before we hear the presentations. The chair will entertain a motion to refer the following bills to the corresponding committees. House Bill 215 to the Committee on Education. House Bill 459 to the Committee on Courts. House Bill 677 to the Committee on Courts. House Bill 825 to the Committee on Courts. House Bill 877 to the Committee of Health, Welfare, and Institutions. House Bill 1080 to the Committee on Courts. And House Bill 1278 to the Committee to ACNR, Agricultural and Natural Resources.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay. I'm not going to waste a lot of time with preliminary remarks, except to say that I want to thank all five of those individuals who are going to provide testimony today. Thanks and gratitude for taking time out of their schedule to make this happen on short notice, and all their preparatory efforts made were quite substantial, I believe, and I just want to thank them publicly for doing so. The first speaker will be Bertha K. Madras, PhD. She's professor of psychobiology in the Department of Psychiatry of Harvard Medical School and directs the Laboratory of Addiction Neurobiology at McLean Hospital. And she will address the impacts of cannabis on the brain. Dr. Madras.
Inviting me, I'm speaking from National Airport, and therefore, without my mask, I may be arrested at any moment, so please indulge me. Distinguished members of the Virginia Assembly, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the fate of marijuana in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Your responsibility is grave, the stakes are high. The decisions you make in this session may echo for generations to come, as they will touch nearly every domain of life in this state, from public health, mental health, safety, healthcare usage, criminal justice, crime, violence, and so many other factors. You've been urged to rush to take action soon. In the words of the executive director of the Virginia National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, you are ceding control of marijuana to illicit, untaxed operators. On the contrary, this historic decision should not be hurried, for it is a social experiment of vast implications which can conceivably lead to remorse. This is an ongoing human experiment without informed consent. I would like to begin, if possible, by doing a slide share with the person who's in charge of the slides so that I can initiate my presentation. So I have received a message saying that I cannot start the screen share while the other participant is sharing. Yes, well, I'm going to try to do my own screen share if that's possible. So if you can remove my slides and allow me to do it from my remote location if possible. So I will do the screen share now. Excellent. I hope this is adequate and everyone can see it. The impact of cannabis on the brain. We have to discuss new marijuana, our most vulnerable people, which are the developing fetus, adolescents, people with mental health problems, and people who use other drugs. Also, the lessons learned from this experiment at this point. Past-year marijuana use has been rising dramatically over the past decade. Can I be heard? I am not muted. The rise is primarily in adults of childbearing years. And there are currently over 13% of adults 18 to 25 who harbor a cannabis use disorder. Between 2016 and 2019, 900,000 more people developed a marijuana use disorder. The lion's share were amongst people 26 and older, approximately 500 million. And so what we're seeing is this dramatic increase in people who are developing a cannabis use disorder. Why is this of concern? It's of concern because parents who use marijuana are likely to influence the use in their children. We did this survey recently, which was published, showing that offspring of parents who use marijuana, whether they're 12 to 17 years old or 18 to 30, if they live in the same households, they are much more likely to use marijuana, and the use depends on how much the parents use. In terms of safety, parents that have a marijuana use disorder compared with alcohol addiction, the negative influence is quite dramatic on child violence and on suicide attempts of the child. This was a huge study done in Denmark with over 1 million families. So we have to recognize that even adult use of marijuana, including amongst parents and especially amongst parents, can confer high risks on their children. What drives marijuana's effect? The composition of the drug, the content of cannabinoids, the amount of cannabinoids, above all, the percent of tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the most important psychoactive constituent of marijuana, and also the absolute amount. The frequency of use is also critical, whether or not somebody uses one time daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly. That has an enormous impact on the outcome. And then the age of exposure, the age at which somebody initiates, whether they're in uterus, whether they're early adolescence or adult onset, and the mode of use, whether or not it's inhaled or smoked or ingested or imbibed in liquids. All of these factors are critical. But what has happened above all since the 1970s is that the potency of marijuana has increased dramatically. With the increase in potency, you get a much greater tolerance to the drug, you get more addiction, you get greater highs and more users, and obviously more profits. And almost any attempt to regulate the potency of THC has been thwarted in states that have legalized. So the new marijuana has higher potency. There are new products, new forms. This is no longer a conventional plant, and there are new delivery systems. Commercial marijuana, the sales of these very potent drugs is rising. The potency is the preference of daily users who account for most of the marijuana users. The cap of percent THC has been very difficult. There's no incentive in states to adopt any caps, at least certainly not in the most recent initiatives. There's increased access to low-potent marijuana, which is more likely to increase frequency of use. And the goal of the industry is to increase demand, increase users, and increase frequent use. Now, the question is there something wrong with that? What are the consequences that could happen to young people, to developing fetuses to adults, so that we have to be concerned about these issues. Because if this was potent broccoli or cauliflower, we would not be at all in this dilemma at the present time. With regard to youth using marijuana, high potency versus low potency confers more regular use, more use problems, more illicit use of other illicit drugs, and more tobacco dependence and more alcohol use disorder. Butane hash oil, which is a very highly concentrated form of the drug, is associated with college students with more binge drinking, more impaired control, more smoking, more academic problems. And so overall, there is an accumulating database that shows that the higher concentration of the drug, it's associated with greater risks of cannabis use disorder, severity of the use disorder, anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, memory impairment, social problems. Now, let us segue into the most significant issues that I foresee. Endocannabinoids, which our brain has, are critical for brain development. They are critical for forming new nerve cells, for how they migrate to their targets, the connections they make, and synaptic pruning in the brain. They promote the birth of new cells. They tell cells what type to become. They guide them to their targets, and they help form connections. They prune and control signals. Pregnant women are using daily or near daily marijuana use at higher rates than ever before. If you can compare 2002, 2003 to 2016 and 17, which is about 15 years later, you find that use rates are much higher in first trimester and they're higher in second and third trimester. What are the consequences? That's the only critical question to ask. Use is not important, potency is not important unless one can find consequences. The surge in marijuana use corresponds with the surge in population use, and in some cases it corresponds with state legal laws. It used during pregnancy, it increases the risk of preterm deliveries, of neonatal intensive care unit admission, of decreased birth weight, less than 5.5 pounds, of decreased 1-minute APGAR scores, but not 5-minute, of decreased head circumference of babies. So there are physical consequences to having exposure to the drug. In the developing fetus, there are changes in signaling systems, errors in neurite growth, in migration, in reorganizing the circuits of very key parts of the brain, and affecting whether or not neurons convert into other types of neurons. With a new adolescent brain cognitive development study, it has been found that people enrolled in the study, approximately 5.7% of infants were exposed to cannabis in uterus. What are the consequences? Psychotic-like experiences, reduced gray and white matter in the brain, functional problems as they get older, in attention, in thought, in social issues, in reduced ability to think, and sleep problems. It's also associated with psychosis proneness during childhood. There's also unintentional poisoning of children as we move up the age spectrum. States with legal marijuana, poisonings are rising. The causes are mainly the different types of cookies and candies and beverages and possibly passive smoke. And what are the signs of this? Lethargy, muscle and function tone is decreased, fast heartbeat, and in some cases, these children have to be transported rapidly to the hospital. We now move up the age scale into the teen brain, and look at what I've developed an acronym called the BAD apps. They're brain changes that we don't have time to go into. But some of these consequences of brain changes are addiction, which is higher in teens, deficits in cognition, which has an impact on education, on short-term memory, on decline of IQ, on school performance. There is amotivational syndrome with higher high school dropouts and lower grades even in college. There are psychiatric diseases and there's safety issues. Globally, the US leads the world in cannabis use disorder amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. That's a dubious distinction that we should not promote. Adolescents are much greater risk for marijuana use disorder, double the risk after 4 years of steady use compared to adults. Teen marijuana use, depending on how much is used, how many times, affects adult motivation with lower acquisition of bachelor's diplomas, more people are unemployed or on welfare as a function of how much they use. And it can impact educational achievement in high school with lower grades, more likely to drop out, less likely to enter college, more likely to delay enrollment for college and to drop out of education. And for frequent users, they're more likely to have marijuana use disorder. More frequent marijuana use before the age of 17. This is a longitudinal study. Very large number of children were involved in tracing them. And what they found is that the more they use, the more frequently they use, there is more cannabis use disorder, other illicit drug, suicide attempts, and lower probability of completing high school or college degrees, which is all summarized here. Marijuana use before the age of 18 is also the highest risk for opioid use disorder. And during adolescence or post-adolescence, those who begin regular use in teens have poorer later life outcomes than non-users. They're more likely to use other drugs, be high-risk alcohol drinkers, smoke daily, less likely to be in relationships. And it's also associated with increased risk of depression and suicidal behavior later in life. It's also a high increased risk for psychosis. The predictors are age of onset of use. The earlier they used, the more frequently they used, the greater exposure to childhood trauma and use of other substances and genetics. What is psychosis? How can we explain it? It's characterized by suspiciousness, paranoid thinking, bizarre thoughts, fragmented thoughts, hallucinations of your ears, your eyes, and your touch sensations. The criteria for whether or not this drug causes or is associated with depends on a number of factors. How strong the association, how consistent the findings are in different places, the timing of if use of the drug precedes or if the psychosis precedes use of the drugs. The stronger the dose, the greater the impact, and so on and so forth. Let's take a quick look at the strength of association. This was a huge meta-analysis of vast databases, over 400 databases, comparing multiple studies from all over the world. And they found that for non-organic, which means not chemically caused or liver disease, for non-organic psychotic disorders, the most robust risk factors are clinical high-risk state, which means a genetic predisposition or other factors. Number 2 was cannabis use. The odds ratio was 4-fold. And the third factor was childhood adversities. In different places, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, New Zealand, Israel, Sweden, and the United States, use increased the risk for psychosis in different nations, which is another confirmatory goal. And in 3 cities, in London, in Amsterdam, and in Paris, it was found that the incidence, the prevalence, the risk of psychosis increased as a function of how much was used and how strong the marijuana was. And it was compared with rare use of strong or weak, once a week or more than once a week. And what you saw in all 3 cities was the same trend. In otherwise normal people, it can induce psychosis. These are 324 participants in 14 studies, and what it showed is that the risks in healthy, otherwise normal people is much higher than if they are not exposed to THC. And what was, again, another systematic review and analysis, which just came out, showing that the medical consequences in adults now, without pre-existing medical or psychiatric conditions, the adverse outcomes most frequently encountered by using the drug is psychosis, psychosocial function, motivation drops, executive function declines, working memory declines, anxiety declines. And once again, how often it's used, what the THC content and age of onset are critical drivers. So when we look at the causality or association, we can see that a number of these factors lean towards marijuana being causal, but not still 100% confirmed by others, although there are many more psychiatrists leaning in the direction that it is a causal factor. What lessons can we learn from this? Vast sums of money were spent to promote the drug. It was promoted for many medical conditions. It was promoted as safe and not addictive. There was poor scientific evidence for repeated heavy use. The type of marijuana was at the discretion of a butt tender, not a physician. Medical education in this has lagged far behind. The advocates have received all the attention and all the approbation, but not the opponents. Youth use is high. It's clear that regulations are not restraining youth from using in legal states, and high potency drugs are flooding the market. If you look at these criteria, you can see that they are the same that catalyzed our prescription opioid crisis in the early 2000s. And marijuana recreational use and medical use are conflated. Above all, regulations failed to protect the public when there was an effort to regulate access in the legal system. So what do we have in terms of unanswered questions? Have legal regulations been effective thus far in protecting young people, in protecting pregnant women, in protecting adults who are susceptible, even if they are unaware that they are at risk? I don't think so. Which drugs are we going to legalize? All current forms of marijuana, including 90% THC, or the old-fashioned planted 1 to 3% THC, where so many of the earlier studies were done? Are we going to legalize only the leaf, or shatters and dabs and concentrates and delta-8 THC and hydroxy, acetylated THC, and all the new psychoactive cannabinoids that have come in the forms of spice and K2, but in the literature, in patents, there are thousands of others. Are you going to restrict it? Will legalization increase use? The answer to that is obvious. Normalization and legalization, commercialization have all fueled the issue. And how do we stop the pipeline? That is up to you as legislators. And then I ask some more questions for architects of legalization. What motivates some to abandon vulnerable people to have access to and continue using addictive drugs? What human good has come from addiction to drugs? Why increase the suffering and financial burden of individuals and families, societies, and nations? How will liberal drug policies prevent recruitment of our children? We know that these so-called state regulations haven't worked. The highest number of users are states that have legalized marijuana or medicalized it. Why is legalization, but not prevention, a primary goal of legislatures? If use and consequences increase with legal supply, how will Virginia address this? And are the legislators willing to engage in the human experiment without informed consent? And so I would like to close with my final slide, and that is to say, this is not waging a war on drugs, not from my perspective, and it never was. This is a defense of our brains, the repository of our humanity. And I hope that as legislators, you recognize that protecting and defending our brains is one of the most compelling public health challenges of this year and the coming decades. Thank you very much for indulging me in this noisy airport presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Madras. Members of the committee, we've kind of allotted 30 minutes for each presentation, so if anybody from the committee has a question, we have a few minutes to do so. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, thank you, Dr. Madras. There do not appear to be any questions. As you know, you're welcome to stay and watch as much of the testimony as you wish before you have to catch your flight.
Thank you
we do
so
wish
much.
you safe travels, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you. And thank you for indulging me. Thank you so much.
The next presenter will be Marilyn Eustace, PhD. She's formerly Chief of Chemistry and Drug Metabolism Section at the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse. Presently, she's a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Emerging Health Professions at Thomas Jefferson University. And she will focus her presentation on drug-impaired driving and the short-term effects of cannabis on the brain. And I might mention to everyone on the committee that I did supply each member of the committee with a notebook with the CVs and bios and any written remarks submitted by the presenters at your desk, which is double-paged, about 2 inches thick. So we have some very impressive policy folks with us this evening, and I hope we garner something from their presentations. Dr. Eustace, floor is yours.
Yes, good evening. Am I running the slides or are you all running the slides? I sent them in, I can run them?
That is your preference. I think we have them and we can try to run them for you, or if you want to try to do it from your laptop.
I'm happy to do it from mine if I can see this. Let's see. So I do not share screen. Okay. And make it full screen. Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everyone. And this is such an important meeting, and we appreciate very much the opportunity to address these issues. I'm going to primarily focus on the short-term effects of cannabis legalization, but I will just mention a few of the long-term effects. I was at the National Institute on Drug Abuse for more than 23 years and did many clinical studies on different aspects, including the pharmacology, the pharmacokinetics, the effects on driving that I'll be talking to you about. And also we participated in many studies of in utero drug exposure to cannabis. So the most important short-term consequence is the effect on driving. However, there are other issues that you can see here: adulterated cannabinoid products, increased emergency department visits by both adults and children, the greater use and ease of access to minors, no matter how hard the legislature tries, it will get into the hands of minors and increase it. And then the increased use of oral cannabis edibles. And as Dr. Madras just beautifully described, the increased incidence of psychosis. Now, the long-term consequences include the effects on the developing brain. And this isn't like we don't have the information already. We have wonderful data that clearly show that the cannabinoid system that we all have in our brains that's been highly conserved over time really is important in the brain developing in the fetus and on into the end of brain development in the late 20s. And it is very much involved with how the neurons actually connect. And it can produce both poor child development outcomes, but these are changes that will last through life. And the earlier adolescents start frequent cannabis use, the greater the effects on the brain. So we have to think about cannabis exposure to the fetus during pregnancy. Also during breastfeeding, we know that THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive chemical in cannabis, very lipophilic and in high concentrations, a 7 to 8-fold concentration in breast milk compared to the mother's blood. Then we have to consider secondhand cannabis smoke in the home and also accidental ingestion of so many products that look like candies. And then, of course, the biggest problem, adolescents and young adults when they start self-administering cannabis. Now, where do we have cannabinoids acting in the brain and what are their effects? So we have the amygdala, which is why people use cannabis, the euphoria, the relaxation. We have also the hypothalamus, where cannabis was actually the endogenous cannabinoid system is a survival function. So it controls appetite so you don't starve. It enforces sex so that the species doesn't die. It includes hormones for reproduction, body temperature control. So it's an absolutely key function in our bodies is the endogenous cannabinoid system that is actually hijacked when someone uses cannabis because the plant cannabinoids will bind to all of these places in the brain and hijack their normal function. And the main function of the endogenous cannabinoid system is to maintain homeostasis, to keep things well controlled and functioning as they should. Now, if you look at the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, those are the main areas for motor control, planning it, initiating it, following through, fine motor control, and there are many cannabinoid receptors in those two areas of the brain, and that's why partially we have the many effects on cannabis and driving. But if you look at the huge cortex of the human brain, that whole area surrounding the older midbrain, that is so critical for executive function. And executive function is everything from taking in the information from your environment, all your sensory, both your eyes, your ears, your nose, etc., touch. Then you have to decide, is this important for me to pay attention to? And that's called salience. Then you have to, if you decide you should pay attention, you reach into your memory and say, what do I know about this? And then you say, okay, I've got to make a decision what to do. How do I react to this? And then you have to carry out whatever function it is that you decide you need to do. And cannabis slows every one of those processes. So they're all part of executive function, decision making, and cannabis slows all of that, which is why it has such a dramatic effect on driving, which is such a complex procedure. Now, this is to give you an idea of what happens when someone inhales a cannabis joint or dab or other form. And each one of these arrows is a single puff on a cannabis cigarette. And you can see how quickly it goes into the blood very, very rapidly, straight up. And as the person starts to feel their heart rate really increasing and also starts to feel the psychological effect that they're using the drug for, they change the way in which they smoke that cigarette. And they change it because they're not very comfortable if their heart is beating out of their chest. And many people don't like to be out of control, and they start feeling like they're losing control. So they take in a little bit less. And what's so interesting is that it actually peaks, the THC peaks before the last inhalation. And we did all this research many years ago. And it was the first time that we could characterize what happens during cannabis smoking. Almost all the studies before, and even now, start after the end of smoking. And then you'll see after it peaks, how rapidly it decreases. What's important to know about this is it rapidly comes out of the blood, but not the brain. So it is distributed throughout the body to the areas that get the most blood, and then to the areas that are fatty tissues, because THC is a very lipophilic compound. So it quickly gets pulled out of the blood. But don't mistake it. It's not pulled out of the brain. The brain is a very fatty tissue too, and the THC stays in the brain, the active component, and it continues to produce effects in the brain. So let's see what happens when you take cannabis different routes of administration, like Dr. Madras was talking about. And we did this study, and you can see here in the gray stripe, this is when people inhale the drug. So this could be inhaled from smoking, from a vaporizer, or even dabbing. And you get a very, very rapid peak that peaks before the end of the inhalations, and then it slowly drops off over time. If they take an edible, the oral route of administration, notice that it comes up much later. So it starts to peak and somewhere between 2 and 4 hours rather than less than 10 minutes. And the peak THC concentration is much lower, and the effects last much longer. And this is what we all knew and understood before I found a way to study chronic frequent cannabis use. And of course, for ethical reasons, for safety reasons, for financial reasons even, at the National Institute on Drug Abuse or any of the other fine universities that do research on cannabis, we cannot give people as much drug as they give themselves. So I finally decided I would bring in our very frequent cannabis users, put them on a closed research unit. They're volunteers. They can leave at whatever time, but they can't come back. And let's see what happens when they stop using cannabis for a long period of time. And the results were amazing, because any toxicologist around the world would have told you the THC is out of the blood in mostly 6 hours, but it could be as long as 10 or 12 in some people. And if you can see here in the middle, this is the THC, the turquoise line. I was able to still measure THC in the blood of people who were on my closed research unit with no access to drugs for 30 days. These data were shocking to all of us, and it certainly turned the world of impaired driving upside down. Because if you can detect THC for weeks after last use, how are we going to use blood THC to identify cannabis users who are driving impaired? The next thing we did is we said, well, what happens when someone is exposed on a daily basis to cannabis? And we know the brain, the endogenous cannabinoid system, tries to keep everything normal, okay, the status quo. And so we were able to measure the density of cannabinoid receptors in specific brain areas. And we compared the density of these receptors of frequent users to healthy, normal individuals. And again, the results were shocking. So this is an objective measure of what happens when people frequently use cannabis. Every time you see a blue bar, that is a significant decrease in the density of these receptors in the brain. And it's each specific area. So the anterior cingulate, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the insula, and so forth, these different areas of the brain. The green bars are the areas where we did not see a significant decrease. But everywhere there's a blue bar, it means there are fewer cannabinoid receptors to carry out the normal critical functions of this system that's so key to our well-being. So this was an important finding that when you use cannabis every day or almost every day, you literally change your brain. So if you've changed your brain, what about psychomotor function? In these same individuals that we were able to measure the blood for so long, we show a decrease in the receptors in the brain. And here are, again, the shocking results. So this is how well people who are chronic frequent cannabis users, not acutely intoxicated, they've been on my unit with no access to drugs, and they perform this much worse compared to controls in being able to have the control to keep the car within their lane. Now, after a week of abstinence, 2 weeks of abstinence, and 3 weeks of no cannabis, they still have significantly poorer performance in this task, driving task. Okay, well, many of you know people who use cannabis. It's the most commonly used drug around the world. So they say, well, I'm tolerant. I use it all the time, so I'm tolerant. I don't have problems driving. And so these are beautiful data out of Yale from Dr. D'Souza's lab. And look at these. The open symbols are the occasional cannabis users, and the closed symbols are the frequent cannabis users. And you can see when neither one is intoxicated, so they're totally sober, the occasional cannabis user is going to perform better on memory tasks than the chronic frequent user. They have some deficit, some impairment in memory. And remember all those receptors that were present in the hippocampus for memory. But when you give them cannabis, now the occasional user has a steeper decline. They're going to show more impairment than the chronic frequent user. But the chronic frequent user still has impairment. They overcome it by taking in more drug. So it's very important to remember that tolerance to cannabis is never complete, and it can be different for different effects. So yes, there is some partial tolerance that develops to the impairment from using cannabis frequently, but it does not prevent performance impairment in driving. And another way to look at it is these are our occasional smokers in the light blue and the frequent smokers in the dark blue. Now, when they received the same amount of cannabis in the same procedure, the occasional users, because of that titration, they get very, very high at a low, say 10 or 12 nanogram per mil concentration of THC. The chronic frequent smoker has some tolerance, and so they've got to take a lot more drug in to get high than the occasional user. But they do that in the way in which they smoke the cigarette. They take more puffs, they hold it in the lungs longer, and they can get much higher concentrations. So here they are at about 35 nanograms per mil in order to reach even a little bit less high. So now we go to some studies in the world's most advanced driving simulator. It's located at the University of Iowa. It was built by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And I am so pleased that after 10 years, they funded me, and Office of National Drug Control Policy funded me to study the effects of inhaled cannabis with and without low-dose alcohol on driving performance. This is an amazing facility. This orb can accelerate, you can put brakes on, it can move very quickly in an entire aircraft hangar, and you can go over gravel and even hear the sound of the gravel and the crunching and feel the bumps. There's a full car inside, and it's very sophisticated. Here I am driving it, and there are cameras on your eyes to see how well you're searching the environment for all of the complex things you do when you're driving. You have to consider lights and the weather and other drivers and people going slower and all the things that happen when we drive. These are the areas we know cannabis affects on driving. Your focus and concentration, your visual search that I was just speaking about, your reaction time to someone slamming on the brakes, your time to process changes in the environment, like you're driving and a child comes out on a bicycle. They should not come into the road, but they do. And even when you see them start to enter the driveway is slightly slower. When you think you see them and you have to react to it, every step is slower. Your ability to divide your attention between what's happening on the roadway, what's happening in your car, what's happening with the lights, that's called divided attention, is greatly affected. Your decision making, your ability to stay within your lane, that weaving within the lane, which we know is one of the most sensitive effects of cannabis on driving, and even autonomous driving, that coming home from work when occasionally I'm thinking about all the stuff I need to do and I drive right by my exit, cannabis will really affect your autonomous driving as well. So individuals either drink juice or alcohol to get them at a 0.05%, lower than our cutoff in the US, but the limit that's used around the world is 0.05%. Then they have 10 minutes to smoke cannabis or placebo cannabis. Then they drive for 45 minutes and we take their blood. And if you will see here, this weaving within the lane, this is so characteristic of cannabis crashes. They weave so much, they cross the line and hit other cars head on, or they weave off the road and hit trees or signs or other objects. And so we were able to show significant effects on weaving within the road in our study. And we know that this is typical of the type of crashes. Low-dose alcohol also significantly increases weaving within the lane. And together, when they were together, they're additive. So you have the effects of the alcohol and the effects of the cannabis. And would you not know that cannabis and alcohol is the most common combination of all the drugs that are used? And so we have a serious problem if people are both having, and the typical thing now is a beer or two and a joint or two. We also showed in this study impaired divided attention performance and other important aspects that I don't have time to go in now. Now, another critical thing that we learned from this study, we knew as toxicologists that the THC goes out of the blood really quickly, but we didn't have some real good objective evidence, and now we do. So we showed that 74% of the THC in the blood is gone in 30 minutes, and 90% in 1.4 average. In the United States, the time to get a blood sample in an impaired driving investigation is between 1.4 and 4 hours. So what does that mean? That means by the time they get the blood, the THC might not be detectable, or it might be below any per se cutoff that a state establishes. And I'm going to come back to that. And so that's why we believe that oral fluid or saliva represents a much better alternative than blood, because it can be collected right at the roadside by the police officer and not have this long delay. It also saves a tremendous amount of money and resources, because in general, the officer is tied up for maybe 2 hours or more in getting that blood sample collected. Now, every time I went to Canada 3 times before they legalized, I went to Colorado, I went to Washington State, and many others. And all the legislators all want to know, what is the magic number? Is it 1, 2, 5 nanograms or micrograms per liter? What will differentiate an impaired driver from an unimpaired driver? And what I'm about to show you tells you there is no magic number. You can't do it, and this is why. So here, these are the percent of samples that are positive for THC in the blood. And we have 2 populations. We have the occasional smokers and the frequent smokers. So look what happens when I dose them with a cannabis cigarette. The chronic frequent smokers, because they have this huge body burden of THC from using it so frequently, they are going to be positive, all of them, for at least 24 hours before it starts to go down, if you use a 1 nanogram per mil cutoff. Now, our occasional users who have no tolerance, these individuals are going to be negative by about 7 hours, and it's falling off really quickly. So you have a lot of impaired drivers out there with no tolerance that are not going to be detected. So, okay, what if we raise it to 5 nanograms per mil, which is the same unit as nanograms per mil, as micrograms per liter? So what happens now? So now look at your occasional smokers that are in the gray. Well, now we have a real problem, because our occasional users are going to be negative by 2.5 hours, and they're going to be highly impaired. And what about our frequent users? Well, yes, they're going to start coming down, and that's a good thing, but look what happens. 16% of our chronic frequent cannabis users have so much THC stored in their fat tissues, including their brain, that they're going to get down to a level where the THC that's being released from their body stores is going to prevent it from going down to non-detectable. So these individuals, about 16%, they're going to be positive at 5 nanograms per mil for hours and hours and hours, including days. So there is no perfect number. There is no perfect per se number. And so that is not the answer to our problem. Per se cutoffs are not supported by the science. And there's another bad thing about per se numbers. It basically says the person is not impaired if they're below that cutoff. And that is simply not true for cannabis and also for other drugs as well. Oral fluid collections and screenings can be done right at the roadside, save money, save police time. And in Australia, all of their roadside testing is oral fluid since 2004. And in Europe, since 2008, it's a mixture of oral fluid and blood still in Europe. Most of them are using oral fluid screen. Half of them use oral fluid confirmation, and the other half, like Germany, uses blood confirmation. But in Germany, they have police riding around in cars all the time waiting for the call. And as soon as an officer calls, a police doctor goes, examines the driver, and takes their blood. We are never going to have that in the United States. Okay, what about the wonderful drug evaluation and classification program, which you probably know as the DRE program? It's in all 50 states. We had the pleasure to collaborate and look with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We compared 302 cases Of cannabis-only positives, that's a rarity. Usually cannabis is present with alcohol, with cocaine, with amphetamines, with benzodiazepines. But they found 302 cannabis-only cases with full DRE exams, and we compared to 302 controls. We looked at every component, finger to nose, where you're directed to put your finger right to the tip of your nose. You're familiar with that. And you can see here that we showed a significant difference between the controls who were not impaired and the cases where they were impaired. And there's a big difference in the results, significant difference between the results. But look at the data showing there was no significant difference whether the THC was less than 5 or more than 5. So again, a proof that the per se does not work. We looked at walk and turn, and we followed that. And again, we found significant differences between the cannabis cases and controls. Again, no significant difference whether the THC was above or below 5. And so what we did is look at every single piece, and we took those that are most sensitive to cannabis. So if you have 2 of these 4 tasks where you show impairment, the finger to nose, the eyelid tremors during modified Romberg, if you have 2 or more clues on the one-leg stand, 2 or more clues on the walk and turn, the DRE exam was able to accurately identify 97% of the cannabis impaired drivers, and there were 3.3% of the controls that were identified as impaired. So how do I suggest you best document impaired driving? Because of the problem of the chronic frequent smoker, because of the problem of the medical cannabis user, I think you must document psychomotor impairment first, so that there is some demonstration by a DRE, by a ride officer with standardized field sobriety tests, by witnesses. You document the psychomotor impairment. Then you collect a biological sample to indicate what drug is producing that impairment, preferably an oral fluid test, but it could also be a blood test, but with the problems I showed you. And then it goes to the laboratory confirmation. Some very important facts. Cannabis impairs performance in laboratory studies, driving simulators, on-the-road driving experiments, and epidemiological investigations. Many, many studies show that cannabis about doubles the odds ratio of a fatal crash. Now, people go, oh, it only doubles. Doubling is a lot. It's less than alcohol. Alcohol has more profound effects. But I don't think you want to increase and double the number of deaths in Virginia due to cannabis-impaired driving. It's not always consistent. The European Union Druid study is one that did not show impairment, but when they looked at it, if THC was in the driver's blood, they had a 2-fold increase that driver was responsible for a fatal crash. Legalization, no matter how you do it, increases the percent of the population using cannabis and the frequency of cannabis use. We have lots of data on that now from states that did legalize the drug. Driving is a highly complex task. The more complex the task, the more you see the impairment by cannabis. There's a number of studies, and I'm almost out of time. I started a little bit late, but there's lots of studies now from the states that have already increased or legalized cannabis, showing about a 2-fold increase. A brand new paper we just published this week showing significant impairment out 3.5 hours after last cannabis use, but in this population, no significant difference by 4.5 hours. What's frightening is 68.6% of participants said they were ready to drive at 1.5 hours, and they were impaired for 3.5 hours. The greatest risk to traffic safety and the most common DUID case is polydrug impairment. A single drug intoxication is much less common. And again, the most common combination is alcohol and THC. And I've provided you with all my references. Thank you for listening. I hope, and I'm certainly available. I'm just in Maryland. I'd be happy to come down and meet with you all and talk further about this important issue. Thank you so much, and good luck with your deliberations.
Thank you, Dr. Hustis, and I appreciate you participating this evening. And again, I can't thank you enough for taking your time to be with us. Our next presenter is Dr. Who? Yes.
I did have just one quick question.
Okay, all right. Yeah, well, I guess we can make time for a question, even though we're.
Yeah. No,
Sure.
I just.
Delegate Bulova.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the question I had, because I'm glad you focused in on the kind of the conundrum of when somebody is impaired or not when they're driving. And I'm also glad that you kind of focused in on the same thing that we've been focusing in on, which is the field sobriety tests and making sure our police are trained to kind of recognize the signs that somebody is impaired. I guess for the oral liquid tests, I guess that's kind of a secondary thing. And I just wanted to make sure my understanding is kind of confirmed that that's really just to go ahead and subsidize, or be able to substantiate what the police officer is saying with the, yes, you have inhaled marijuana within a certain period of time. And I'm just wondering if you could reiterate what period of time the oral liquid test. So is that 24 hours, a week, 72 hours?
Okay. It's approximately similar to what you get with blood, it's about that. So that, again, it depends, just like in blood. If they're a chronic frequent user, it potentially could be a little bit longer. But the point is that you're not doing the oral fluid test until you have shown and documented the impairment. And what its purpose is to say what drugs might be on board that are producing that observed impairment. So what would happen, there are roadside tests, but what I recommend is it's fine to do the roadside tests, and they will identify, say, about 8 or 9 or 10 of the most common drugs. But you take, since you've established the impairment, you take a confirmation sample and it goes to a laboratory, which will test for many other drugs. Because you're all aware we have all these new novel psychoactive substances that certainly are not going to be picked up on a roadside test. So you do the impairment documentation, you take the oral fluid test, you can do the screen to see if it's cannabis or opioids or cocaine or methamphetamine. And if it's still negative, that's confirmation sample goes and they can look for a much broader spectrum to support the officer's conclusion of impairment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
Delegate Wampler, you had a quick question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Hustis, back at the beginning of your presentation, you brought up the endogenous cannabinoid system in our body, and I was hoping that you could expand on that briefly. And I'm trying to figure out, is there any other substance on Earth that would fit into your cannabinoid receptor system that's in your body outside of cannabis?
Yes, the synthetic cannabinoids. So these novel psychoactive substances, we as toxicologists, we worried so much about 10 or so major compounds as really drugs of abuse. And then along comes the novel psychoactive substances starting somewhere around 2004. And there are now over 800 brand new synthetic drugs that have been produced and are all over the world. And the ones that mimic cannabis are called synthetic cannabinoids, and they will bind to the very same receptors that the THC in cannabis binds to. So those are very potent. They're up to 100 times as potent as cannabis. So we have synthetic drugs. You, of course, I'm sure, are aware of the terrible opioid epidemic that we have going on. And there's designer opioids are mimicking the opioids. And we have designer benzodiazepines that mimic, diazepam and Valium. And we have we have designer stimulants that mimic cocaine and amphetamine. So those are the compounds that also could bind to the endogenous cannabinoid system.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for these questions. Hey, thank you again, Dr. Eustis. Our next presenter is Dr. Hoover Adger. He's a professor of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine, and I believe he will focus on the long-term effects of cannabis. Dr. Adger, thank you for being here.
I'm honored to be here and to present to this audience. And I'll start out by saying I agree with the last two speakers that the last thing that one wants to do is to run into this with an unclear understanding of what will come as a result of legalization. And so I hope that these comments are helpful. I'm going to focus primarily on the adverse health effects, and I'm going to focus primarily on adolescents. I'm a pediatrician by training. I'm a clinician, however. I run a outpatient treatment program within our institution, and I also spend a lot of time in treatment settings out in the community. I tend to look at addiction as a developmental disease because oftentimes what we see is that it is a process which starts in adolescence and unfortunately sometimes in childhood. But if we look at over 90% of adults who eventually receive a diagnosis of a substance use disorder, those individuals usually begin their use throughout adolescence. And you can see here exhibited on the slide, which is just the age of onset of cannabis use disorder, which is illustrating that. I can go pretty quickly through some of these slides because Dr. Eustis and Dr. Madras did such a great job of outlining the well-supported scientific evidence. But it's clear that marijuana, cannabis, and other drug addiction is a chronic brain disease. It has the potential for both recurrence and for recovery. We see that the process of moving from voluntary use to addiction is something which is characterized by episodes of repeated cycles of use. For many individuals, it's the characterization of binge, periods of intoxication, withdrawal, associated negative affect, development of preoccupation, which moves into an anticipation. But the cycle becomes more severe with continued use despite consequences, and is driven by the continued use, which causes problems in many areas with brain functions, which reduces one's ability to control that substance use. Let me just move this out of my way here. There's well-supported data which shows that there's disruption in a number of key areas. Some of those key areas are outlined on the slide here. Those areas have been outlined previously, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but they're the basal ganglia, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex. We see that disruptions in these key areas enables substance-associated cues to trigger seeking, and we've heard this referred to as increased incentive salience. But this is a driver for many individuals. These disruptions reduce the sensitivity of brain systems involved in the experience of pleasure and reward, and also activation of brain stress systems. And also these disruptions reduce functioning of brain executive control systems, which govern the ability to make decisions and to regulate one's actions, emotions, and impulses. You put this all together and you see that many of these changes in the brain persist for long after use stops. We know that there's little that is known about how much of this might be regained and how long the process may take in some individuals. But it's clear that adolescence is a critical at-risk period for substance use and addiction. And it's clear that all of the addictive drugs, including marijuana, are potentially harmful in terms of their effects to the adolescent brain, which is undergoing development. I won't spend time on this because it's already been talked about, but what we have is activation of reward pathways by addictive drugs. And so whether we're talking about nicotine, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, they share neuroreceptor pathways which activate reward systems. But if you look here, what we see is that there are cannabinoid receptors which are located throughout the brain. And these cannabinoid receptors regulate key functions. These key functions come in the form of affecting brain development, memory and cognition, motivational systems and reward, appetite, immunological function, reproduction, movement coordination, and also pain regulation and analgesia. But we have to remember that it's important to look at this within the context of the developing adolescent brain. And this pictogram just shows to the far left the brain at 5 years of age, and you see a gradual change as one goes from 5 years of age to 20 years of age. The important thing to recognize is that maturation occurs from the back and then moves front. And so those areas which are responsible for executive decision-making are the last parts to come online. So that the earlier systems to mature are those systems related to the limbic system. Those are involved in processing emotions, feelings, social information, the experience of reward, punishment. It's only later in the mid to late 20s that we get maturation of the prefrontal cortex, where we have deliberative thinking, logical reasoning, the ability to plan ahead, weighing the costs and the benefits, and also the ability to regulate impulses. Now, I show this slide just to make the point that who but an adolescent or a young adult could conceive of doing something like this, literally jumping off the cliff. It makes the case that adolescents are pretty much in the go-go system, and that system which gives us the ability to think about this before we actually do it is less mature in the adolescent. And that's one of the things which makes the adolescent so amazing, but it's also one of the things which oftentimes functions as a major problem in terms of decision-making. So what we see is that it's not just that the immature adolescent brain means that risky judgment is pervasive. It is really that the reward incentives are so much more salient and so much stronger than the perception of the consequences. So what we have is the fact that repeated episodes, prolonged drug use changes the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. And we've heard some reference to some of these changes. This is a slide which just illustrates this. This is a PET scan, a positron emission tomographic scan of the brain. But what this shows is not only the structure of the brain, but it also shows the function of the brain. On the top panel, what you see is a normal subject. On the bottom, you see someone who is a frequent marijuana user. And you can see that on the bottom panel, this brain is structurally and functionally quite different than that of a normal individual who does not have that characteristic. And so what we have is that yes, adolescents and many start at a point where it's voluntary use. But through repeated use, there is something that happens that causes a fundamental change in the brain, which leads individuals to a point of compulsive drug use and that stage that we characterize as dependent or addiction. Problem is that we don't have a good way of understanding who will be the individual, what are some of the triggers. It is really multifactorial. So there are a number of things which filter into this. There are many things which are happening during this transition from voluntary use to the stage of addiction. It's likely that this transition involves learning, memory. There's a number of things that happen here, but there are fundamental changes which happen to the brain. There are structural changes which happen. There are cellular adaptations which drives a process to what we see as the stage that we frequently refer to as addiction. So essentially what we see is that chronic, frequent drug use leads to a state where the drugs usurp brain circuits, where there is a change in structure and function, a change in motivational priorities. And a number of these lead to what we can clearly see as documented adverse, both short-term and long-term features which are associated with use of cannabis. And so if we look at the effects of short-term use, we see that it's been documented that there's impaired short-term memory, making it difficult to learn and retain information. There's impaired motor coordination, interfering with driving skills that we just heard, increasing the risk of injuries. It's interesting because if we look at adolescents and young adults as a group, 70% of the morbidity and mortality is due to three major causes. 70% of morbidity and mortality in adolescents and young adults, they're usually a healthy group. That's unintended injuries or accidents. Motor vehicle accidents are a big part of that. Homicide, suicide. Those three things together, which is 70% of the morbidity and mortality, have a direct link to marijuana and other drug use. There's altered judgment, increased risk of risky behaviors, sometimes resulting in sexual behaviors that facilitate the transmission of sexually transmitted infections, which oftentimes can be quite devastating. In high doses, we have seen that there's paranoia, psychosis. If we look at the long-term or heavy use, we see that across the board, individuals give numbers someplace in the area of 9% or so overall. But for adolescents, that number is much higher. There's clear evidence that there's altered brain development. There's poor educational outcomes with increased likelihood of dropping out of school. There's cognitive impairment with lower IQ among those who were frequent users during adolescence. There's diminished life satisfaction and achievement, which is oftentimes determined on the basis of subjective and objective measures as compared to such ratings in the general population. There are symptoms of chronic bronchitis and other respiratory symptoms. And also there's increased risk of chronic psychosis disorders in persons with a predisposition to such disorders. There's no doubt that if we look at the confidence in the evidence that we have, it's fairly high. And so if we look at the evidence in support of addiction to marijuana and other substances, the level of confidence is high. Abnormal brain development, progression to use of other drugs, schizophrenia, depression and anxiety, level of confidence is still fairly high. In terms of diminished lifetime achievement, motor vehicle accidents, respiratory symptoms, the evidence is fairly strong. This is a slide which shows the same thing. If we look at long-term effects of marijuana, we look at addiction across the board, it's about 9% for adults, but for adolescents, that number is much higher. This is a slide which shows that cannabis use and later outcomes are dose dependent. This is a fairly robust study with a large study population showing outcomes in terms of the percent of individuals who are welfare dependent, stratified by the frequency of use, the percent of individuals who are unemployed, stratified by the frequency of use, mean personal income, and the percent who gain a college degree. Again, if you look at the highest numbers of individuals who are welfare dependent, the highest number of individuals who are unemployed are those individuals who are using at the highest amounts. Again, these are areas where there is a huge dispensation of state and federal resources to address the needs of individuals in these groups. This slide looks at the frequency of cannabis use before age 17 and adverse outcomes for individuals who are 30 years of age. And what you see here is that there is a consistent dose response found between frequency of adolescent cannabis use and adverse outcomes. So again, if you look at the bottom left and you look at cannabis dependence and you look at the frequency with which individuals are using, the highest rate of individuals who meet the category of cannabis dependence are those who are using the most frequent. If you look at the use of other illicit drug use, you see the same thing. If you look at suicide attempts, you see the same thing. But if you look at those markers, particularly which are important for adolescents and young adults, if you look at high school completion, those who are using frequently are the least likely to finish high school, the least likely to attain a degree, and also the most likely to be dependent on welfare. This is a slide which looks at persistent cannabis use and shows a neuropsychological decline from childhood to midlife. This is from a study referred to as the Dunedin study. What they did was, it was a prospective study of over 1,000 individuals who were born in 1972, 1973. All of these individuals were tested for IQ at age 13 and age 38. They were also tested for THC use at ages 18, 21, 26, 32, and 38. And what you see is, if you look at the red bar, which is those individuals who were cannabis dependent before 18, in contrast to the blue bar, those individuals who were not cannabis dependent before age 18, you see that there is a much more significant decrement in terms of neuropsychological decline. The study actually showed that there's about an 8 IQ point drop in these individuals. And I think the concerning thing about the study is that it doesn't appear that this is able to be regained during adulthood. Now, we've talked a little bit about amotivation and THC. This is just a study, again, to make the case that if you look at a neuroreceptor, dopamine as a marker in adolescent abusers, what you see on the top set of brain images are healthy controls. What you see on the bottom are individuals who are frequent marijuana users. What this shows is that there is a reduced amount of dopamine reactivity in a key area in the brain in marijuana frequent users that's associated with negative emotionality. And so there's a clear impact on feeling emotions that can be demonstrated in individuals who are frequent users. We talked about some of the impacts on mental health. I won't spend a lot on this, but this one study shows that in a study of Swedish military conscripts, if you look at cases per 1,000 individuals in terms of cannabis-associated psychosis. If you look at the number of times individuals use cannabis, you see that there's an increasing presence of cannabis-associated psychosis in those individuals who are using most frequent. If you look at the bottom left, which is a prospective study, it looks at the risk of schizophrenia-like psychosis at the age of 26 in cannabis users by age 15. Looks at cannabis users by the age of 18. Again, what we're looking at is those individuals who start using at the earliest ages are those who are at the most risk. The top slide here shows that regular cannabis use increases schizophrenia risk in those with a specific genotype. And then the bottom right shows that there is an effect of high potency cannabis that's associated with the risk of psychosis. And again, because we see the emergence of high potency cannabis, it clearly puts individuals at increased risk. This is another way of just showing the same thing. This is from information that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that increasingly what we're seeing is much higher potency of THC that is mirrored by a higher presence of individuals who are presenting to our emergency departments. It all comes down to this, I think, where the rubber hits the road. If you look at studies, it shows that marijuana interferes with attention, with motivation, with memory, with learning. We see that students who use marijuana regularly tend to get lower grades and they're more likely to drop out of high school than those who don't use. Those who use it regularly may, in fact, be functioning at a reduced level of intellectual capacity most or all of the time. There's also an increased recognition of the observation that to the extent that young people don't perceive harm, rates of use tend to escalate. It's an important thing to take note of. Many of my patients, particularly my adolescent patients, because of all of the talk about legalization, assume that this is harmless and it must be something that's good. But what we see is that marijuana hurts the developing teen brain in a number of ways. The teen brain is still developing. It's especially vulnerable to drug use, even to the point where we see that there are studies that show that regular heavy use leads to documented decrease in IQ points. Heavy use being linked to educational outcomes where there's lower grades, lower performance in terms of exam scores, less likely to enroll in college, less likely to graduate from high school or college, lower satisfaction with life, more likely to earn a lower income, more likely to be unemployed. Now, these next two slides are older data, but this is why young people come to see me. It's not because they feel that they have a problem, it's because they're getting into difficulty in school. And so the slide shows that marijuana use is related to other delinquent behaviors. This shows the percentage of those in the age group 12 to 17 who report delinquent behavior in the past 6 months by the number of days marijuana is used in the past year. And if you look at the percent of individuals who are cutting class, it's those individuals who are using the most. Percent of individuals who are engaging in mischievous behaviors, stealing, same numbers in terms of aggressive antisocial behavior. It's clearly linked to the frequency of marijuana use. Again, it's 12 to 17-year-olds who report aggressive behavior. If you look at the percent of individuals who are reported for physically attacking individuals, destroying other people's property, there are many who say that, all the problems, particularly problems which affect our urban areas, will be solved by legalization. It will not. My concern is that we're dooming particularly our marginalized populations to an era where they are getting into trouble. These are young people who are falling prey to, I think, a lack of understanding. And because they are adolescents and much more subject to get into trouble, they have a great time of trying to get through this. This just reminds me that this is all preventable. The slide shows that when the perceived risk drops down and individuals don't think that there's much harm associated with this, use goes up. When the perception of risk goes up, and when we as a community, when we as a society give clear and consistent messages that this is not the thing that we want for young people and young adults, then use goes down. I think it's incumbent upon us, because the science is clear, we need to give clear and consistent messages, and we need to have our policies be guided by science. And so I'll end with information which comes from Dr. DuPont. We do need clear prevention messages, no use of alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drug for reasons of health. It reflects the powerful research on the negative effects of these substances, not only on the body's vital organs, but also on the uniquely vulnerable adolescent brain. I think that it's a public message of no use, which is realistic, and it's consistent with the data, which shows that many teens are choosing to not use any substances. And with that, I'll conclude my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Adger. Does anyone on the committee have a question for Dr. Adger? Okay. You did such a good job. Nobody has any questions, Doctor. I appreciate you making time to be with us here today and all the work and effort you put into preparing your presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Robert DuPont. He is the president of the Institute for Behavior and Health, Inc., and he will address, in general terms, the commercialization of the cannabis market. Dr. DuPont, are you with us?
Thank you very much. Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, it's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here. I'm very proud to be asked for information from this committee. Virginia is facing a very important decision, and anything I can do to contribute. But I also want to say that the three previous speakers are the leaders in this field, not just in the United States, but all over the world. These are world-class speakers, and I'm just very proud to be here with them. And I have been listening to all their remarks and enjoyed it and appreciated it very much. Just by way of background, I graduated from the Harvard Medical School in 1963 and completed my psychiatric training at Harvard and NIH. I specialized in the study of prevention, treatment, and drug problems continuously since 1968. I served as the second White House drug czar in the United States under two presidents. I was the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse from 1973 to 78. And following public service, I founded the Institute for Behavior and Health, of which I am president. This is a 501c3 public policy organization. And since 1980, I've been clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University Medical School. It's my privilege to be here with you. Cannabis is the most widely used drug other than alcohol and nicotine in the United States, and will be for generations to come in the states that have legalized it for medical and recreational purposes, and for those that have not legalized it. There was early hope that state-based legalization would end the black market in those states that had it for legal cannabis. However, our nation's experience since the first states to legalize cannabis have made it clear that illegal cannabis flourishes in both the states that have legalized it and those states that where it remains illegal. Legal cannabis has not ended, and let alone threatened, the illegal business. Illegal sellers of cannabis are such efficient competitors that some legal cannabis sellers have begun petitioning their states to reduce or eliminate their taxes to aggressively prosecute cannabis sellers so that they can compete more effectively. To date, those efforts have failed to deter the illegal market in the states that have legalized cannabis, to establish that point very clearly. There is abundant research on the health harms of cannabis that can be seen in the publications of distinguished organizations, including the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the leader in global research on cannabis for the whole world. I'm very proud of that background. I'm also very proud to be a colleague of the three people who we've had here in this presentation. As they have noted, well-researched connections between cannabis use and impaired attention and memory. Perhaps then it will be not surprising to you to learn that cannabis can also have direct negative effects on academic achievement. Adolescents who use cannabis are much less likely to graduate from high school and earn a degree. And among college students, cannabis is associated with skipping class, lower GPA, and delayed graduation. Moreover, academic achievement significantly improves when students stop their cannabis use. One of the big things that's happening on American college campuses is the development of a large community of young youth who are in recovery. And one of the most dramatic pieces of evidence about the effect of the cannabis on their academic performance is what happens to those kids who are in recovery. Their grades zoom up. They're entirely different people once they stop, the very same people when they're not using. However, it is notable that no matter the legal status of cannabis, for adults, recreational cannabis remains illegal in the states for everyone under 21. And I want to emphasize that. Legalizing cannabis for adults does not change the status at all for adolescents. And much of the presentation we've heard tonight has focused on the adverse effects of cannabis on young people. And yet young adults under 21 have some of the highest rates of the use of the drug. Nationally, 1/5 of young adults 18 to 20 in all the states used cannabis in the last month, as did 1/4 of those aged 21 to 25. And these are numbers far higher than you see in older populations. Moreover, the way in which the cannabis is used today is much different from in recent years, largely driven by heavier, more chronic use. In 2002, less than 13% of past year cannabis users aged 18 and older were daily users, meaning that they used 21 or more days in a month. In 2020, that figure was 23% in the United States. Further research estimates, and this is a very important point to think about, that the daily users of cannabis account for 80% of cannabis sales and consumption. 80% of the cannabis is consumed by people who are daily or near daily users. The question I ask you to think about is will legalizing cannabis for adults in Virginia be a net gain or a net loss for the health of citizens of the state? I think that's the question that we're here to discuss. We know from epidemiologic data and highway research that polysubstance use, and you've heard about this in other presentations, is common, almost universal. The challenge facing the nation and Virginia is not only about the legal status and public health impact of cannabis or even any one specific drug. Instead, it is about cannabis and other drugs, both legal and illegal. And again, you've heard that very much in talking about the except on highways, but it's also true for education. And we'll see some more data on that in a minute. The question I urge you all to ask is whether this is in the interest of the health of the citizens of Virginia. Legalization is an official, public stamp of approval for the sale and use of cannabis by the state. It unleashes the full power of the legal economy, for-profit industry, analogous to the, and often tied to, the alcohol and tobacco industries, to promote the use of the drug and to provide steady, diverse, attractive supply to consumers. The power of legalized cannabis is easily seen in the states that have taken this step to legalize both its sale and use. And that power is awesome. And it has a profound effect on the quality of the decisions that people are making. Legal cannabis is more widely accepted, and perhaps more importantly, actively publicly promoted in highly visible ways. Sellers of illegal cannabis are resourceful and effective, but the legal cannabis sellers, the legal cannabis sellers are a great magnitude and very stiff competitors for the illegal market also. It's very striking, but the legal market is so visible in the states that have done it and so potent and so widespread. Consider our nation's longstanding experience with alcohol and tobacco, where Only after decades of struggle and debate, there are now some rules about these powerful industries' products and their marketing. Such rules do not exist or are ineffective in the states that have legalized cannabis. Alcohol and tobacco are not more biologically attractive than cannabis, yet they produce far more illness and social costs than cannabis and other illegal drugs because they are legal and thus far more widely used. We have a far better understanding of the negative health effects of these two drugs. Adding a third drug will not reduce the serious public health costs of those two drugs. Now, the next slide, I want to be sure you get there. It's had teen cannabis use associated with. Can you get that slide? I don't see it there. Teen cannabis use associated with higher use of other drugs. I don't see the slide. But anyhow, let me tell you what it shows.
Dr. Pine, you want to hold on just for a second? We'll see if we can get that slide up for you.
That would be great if you could. It's got colors to it. It's got orange and green, and there you got it. That's it. Thank you very much. This slide is worth the effort, and I appreciate your taking it. Now, on the left is American teens 12 to 17 who in the last month had not used any cannabis. On the right is youth 12 to 17 all over the country, a national sample done by the SAMHSA organization, the federal government, who had used any cannabis in the last month. So the only difference was, did they use cannabis at all, even one cigarette or one dose, or not? That's the only difference. Now look at this. Then the question is, did they use other drugs? Okay, let's look at the orange one. You'll see if they did not use cannabis, 8% used alcohol. If they used any cannabis, 44.6% used alcohol. Think about that. And you see that with the other drugs too. That's true for binge alcohol use, heavy alcohol use, cigarette use, and other illicit drug use. Rather than substitute for alcohol or tobacco, cannabis is complementary. It is additive. Cannabis users are more likely to drink alcohol, more likely to smoke cigarettes than those who do not use cannabis. A recent study of youth use identified that this close connection between cannabis and the use of other drugs is also true for alcohol and cigarettes. Youth who have used cannabis in the past months were, and I'm going to get these numbers so you can think about this. If the youth used any cannabis, they were 5 times more likely to drink alcohol. They were 8 times more likely to binge drink, that is, consume 5 or more drinks in a setting. They were 16 times more likely to be heavy alcohol use, mean binge drinking 5 or more times in a month. They were 9 times more likely to report smoking cigarettes and 10 times more likely to use other illicit drugs than their peers who had not used cannabis in that past month. The identification of the many health harms of the use of alcohol and tobacco took decades of scientific work and public advocacy. This was necessary to overcome the entrenched, profit-driven efforts of those industries to ignore those harms despite their enormity. The same is now going on with cannabis. While the now triumphant cannabis industry energetically refutes or minimizes research into the harms produced by cannabis use, they work tirelessly to project the health benefits and the safety of this clearly addictive drug. After our century-long struggle to face the many negative health consequences of the use of alcohol and tobacco, it is reasonable to expect the cannabis industry to warn their customers of the negative health effects and other dangers of cannabis, to join in efforts to prevent and mitigate them. I do not see that happening today. In summary, from a health perspective, the best policy on cannabis is to discourage use, not to encourage it. And encouraging is precisely what legalization does. I'm very well aware that legalization for adults does not legalize it for youth, but it does put the state's stamp on it as this is a healthy, acceptable health behavior. And I think the key message from a public health point of view is to discourage the cannabis use, especially among the youth, and to make that very, very clear. Further, if cannabis is legalized, then clear statements about its many serious health effects, negative health effects, especially adverse effects on driving, other activities that require clear thinking, are needed. Commercial advertising for cannabis, a hallmark of what happens with legalization, and the use of cannabis under the age of 21 must be minimized as a top priority. A free-for-all legislation is the worst option because of the incredible power of the legal industry to shape behavior. Again, I ask, is the health and safety of the Commonwealth of Virginia better or worse off with legalized cannabis? While you will make the decision, my message to you is clear. Legalization has an important negative effect on health and safety. I end my testimony with a quote from my colleague, Nora Volkow, the current director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, of which I'm proud to say I was the first director. Here is the quote: "The greatest mortality from drugs comes from legal drugs. The moment you make a drug legal, you're going to increase the number of people who get exposed to it, and therefore you increase the negative consequences from its use. When you legalize, you create an industry whose purpose is to make money selling those drugs. And how do you sell it? Mostly by enticing people to entice them to take the drugs at high quantity. And I want to remind you again that 80% of the cannabis in the country is consumed by people who are daily or near daily users. It's my privilege to be with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I very much appreciate the gravity of the decision you're making. And I'm greatly honored to have my views added to your consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. DuPont. Does anyone on the committee have a question for Dr. DuPont? Okay. Thank you again for being here and all the time you spent in preparation for your presentation, Dr. DuPont. We have one last presenter, and this one will be in person, which we may need at this late hour to help attention spans. Dr. Michelle Peace, who is a local presenter. She's a CEO and a founding partner for Cardinal Quality Laboratories, LC, an associate professor in the Department of Forensic Science at the Virginia Commonwealth University here in our city of Richmond. Thank you for being here and taking the time to prepare for a presentation.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your esteemed colleagues. Certainly, I am keenly aware that I am between you and the door. So, but I really do appreciate your time. I understand the gravity of the decisions that are before you. And so I appreciate the time that you have taken to allow me and my professional colleagues some time to present to you. I am going to tighten our focus a little bit. And so if it would please you, Mr. Chair, I have brought some samples with me today that my laboratory has tested, and Nash can show you some of those examples.
We like visual aids.
Yes. Oh, fantastic. I have them. Okay, so I'm going to tighten our focus into what is happening in Virginia today, particularly with regards to issues around quality assurance and the kind of access that our citizens, our residents, and our visitors to the Commonwealth actually have. And these citizens, residents, and visitors are not able...
I interrupt you these will be recollected after the meeting, okay? These are not to take home. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
That's okay. Of course you had to. I think one of the overwhelming concerns that we have when we take a tight focus is that our citizens, our residents, and our visitors to the Commonwealth do not have access to adult use legal retail products. And so the products that they do have access to are not regulated. and have no quality testing. And so I'm going to walk you through some of these. I'll describe some of the products through the course of my presentation. Whatever it is that you're holding, I'm familiar with them, so through our testing process. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have with regards to those. So I am going to provide a little bit of historical context to set up the stage here for issues around quality assurance, and particularly in the retail legal market. And I want to couch that in the evolution of industry and of science as well, and that really we have facilitated an emergence of unregulated products that are available in the Commonwealth. So these are just the highlights. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about highlights in state legislation. So we understand that in 1996, California was really the first to make medical marijuana legal in that state, and that Oregon decriminalized. And then if we advance to 2012, we're really aware of the fact that Colorado and Washington made adult use legal retail legal for their residents. And what is part of this timeline and is complicates our issues is that in 2018, the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, what we know as the Farm Bill, legalized hemp. And with the legalization of hemp and with the definition of hemp comes this that hemp products have to be less than 0.3% THC on a dry weight plant basis. This makes things very complicated. I'm sure most of you are not holding plant material. So, with all of that said, the timeline is important, and it's important in this context that we have this patchwork of legalization and regulation across the United States. And the reason why I point that out is because the industry has been very quick to fill in certain gaps that have existed when regulations have not progressed as quickly as they should have. Legislation has left some gray areas. And so the industry has been quick to step into that space. And I'm going to demonstrate for you what happens when certain gaps exist, and that in the Commonwealth, because we have some advantage of history, because we have advantage of states who have come before us, it's really an imperative for us to seriously consider what has happened prior to and make sure that the decisions that we make for regulation in the Commonwealth of Virginia as robust as we can. So we have the rise of the cannabis industry, right? So we have adult use legal retail and medical marijuana. And so these are regulated products. There are requirements for these products. These requirements entail quality assurance testing of the plant, of the extract, of the products themselves. Those requirements include potency testing, pesticides analysis, heavy metals analysis, residual solvents, toxins, bacteria and mycotoxins, and in some cases, there is some motivation to assess for terpenes. And so in the Commonwealth, the medical marijuana program is regulated and has requirements for quality assurance testing for the medical program. So one of this quality assurance testing is assuring is that chemicals that are put into the soil that are absorbed by the plant are not going to be passed on to the consumer. These are, of course, things like pesticides and herbicides. While a plant is getting processed, while oil is being extracted out of those plants, chemicals can be applied to the plant material, to that biomass. And we want to make sure that those chemicals don't remain in the products to get passed to the consumer. And we know that while products are being manufactured, whether that is a tincture, some kind of edible, that those products also don't have chemicals in them that would be harmful to the consumer. What quality assurance testing is also going to assure is that whatever is on the label means that that's what's in the product. And so the challenge with the products that you are holding in front of you is that, A, they were not quality tested, despite the fact if you take a look at the products, many of you are probably holding a product that has a QR code on it. That QR code is supposed to go to a lab report. And oftentimes, those lab reports are false. They're false in terms of creating the illusion that they have been quality tested. So, a regulated program makes sure that what is in the package is on the label. The label is also supposed to indicate what a serving would be, so that we are clear in communicating to the consumer an amount of the product that would be reasonable for them to take. So in this situation, one of the things that can be particularly confusing or not really thought about by the consumer is that in this situation, you have a brownie that is probably 2 inches by 3 inches. A regular consumer is not going to say, well, that's 16 servings. So more than likely, that consumer is going to consume the entire brownie. So a regulated program makes sure that serving sizes are consistent, are clear, support proper dosing, and that the package is what's in the label. So with the Farm Bill, with the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, introduced a third industry nationwide. And so these are hemp-based products. These products are unregulated. They are not quality tested. This has given rise to black market and gray market products. Gray market products are products that where the plant has been grown under regulatory framework and then sold in an illegal fashion. So these products, again, are not quality tested. I'm going to take a side turn here. One of my colleagues that spoke in front of me talked about novel psychoactive substances. And I have to take a step back to explain what these are in the space of cannabis. These are purely synthesized cannabinoids. The reason why we have these cannabinoids is because they're researchers, pharmacists, toxicologists were trying to figure out how to leverage that chemical compound to fit inside of the CB1 receptor so that we could get the benefits from the CB1 receptor of that molecule fitting in there and none of the bad things that could be associated with it. And so these synthetic cannabinoids are complicated. There's generations of them. So you see the top cannabinoid, of course, is delta-9 THC. There are analogs that look like delta-9 THC. There are other analogs, other synthetic cannabinoids that deviate from that original shape of the molecule. And so it's complicated. These synthetic cannabinoids, actually worldwide, these processes for making these have all been published in the scientific literature. And so again, the intention for making these synthetic cannabinoids was to find pharmaceutical benefit. What has wound up happening, though, is that people that had more nefarious intentions essentially robbed the scientific literature for how to make these products. And so in 2004, we saw the first synthetic cannabinoid was sold as Spice or K2 on the internet. Subsequent to that, we began to see poisonings because, as Dr. Hustis talked about, some of these synthetic cannabinoids are 100, 300, 800 times more powerful than THC itself. So people consuming these products, not knowing what they were getting, not knowing how much was in them, were having overdoses, and in some cases have been dying. These are from the synthetic cannabinoids. The demand for a synthetic cannabinoid has been on the increase. And so one of the things and this is again speaks to what one of my previous colleagues talked about, was that these synthetic cannabinoids, there are more than 800 of them. At one time, we saw one novel psychoactive substance emerging per week for years. So this is particularly concerning. What we see in the top slide is that the number of synthetic cannabinoids that have emerged in Europe has decreased, but in the bottom slide, you see that the demand for them has increased. So there's still public interest in consuming synthetic cannabinoids. So hold on to the synthetic cannabinoid. I'm going to turn back to the Agricultural Improvement Act and the emergence of the CBD market. So the nature of my research, funded by the Department of Justice through the National Institute of Justice, is that we've been monitoring electronic cigarettes and how they have been used and manipulated to vape other substances. And so the nature of that, of course, we published quite a bit. And we got a call one day from somebody who had a really horrible reaction to a product that they purchased from Diamond CBD. Diamond CBD is a company that is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And so, not knowing what he took, he wasn't sure why he had this one particular reaction to CBD. He actually asked if it was an allergic reaction. We said, probably not. Why didn't you send us the product? So when we tested it, we found a synthetic cannabinoid, and I'll show you that. But before I do, I want to show you, these are screenshots from their website, 100% natural CBD extracts. You'll see in the bottom left that an e-liquid is $90. And so we do a lot of surveillance. If an e-liquid is particularly expensive, we purchase it because it oftentimes has an illicit substance in it. You see that they also say that they quality test all of their products. So we didn't know where this young man got the e-liquid that he vaped, so we went online and bought directly from the distributor. We didn't buy from a secondary distributor. We didn't buy out of a shop. We bought directly from Diamond CBD. And so out of the 9 products that we tested, 4 of them had 5-fluoro-ADB in it, which is a dangerous synthetic cannabinoid that has killed tens of thousands of people worldwide. 1 product had dextromethorphan in it. Dextromethorphan is the active ingredient in over-the-counter cough syrup. So you might imagine I was really angry over this, right? Because think about that website, quality tested, safe for children to take. We randomly purchased off of their website. This is an unregulated industry. So, of course, the CEO of Diamond CBD spent several months trying to discredit me and my lab. And so what he wound up doing is now he has random products out of his production sent to a laboratory for testing for other synthetic cannabinoids. Nowhere in this targeted analyte list, right? These are the only synthetic cannabinoids that get tested for out of this lab. Nowhere on this list is 5-fluoro-ADB. Nowhere on this list is dextromethorphan. The CEO said he went back and evaluated products out of the batch that we purchased. This is an unregulated industry. There's no way he knew what batch we purchased out of. And so he does say that wherever he drew this product, that it actually detected that melatonin was the major ingredient and that CBD was the minor constituent. So still a significant problem with quality assurance and what they're putting in their product. So we started this process of evaluating CBD products in my laboratory. And so some of what we have seen some products twice the amount of CBD. We've seen some products that have actually no CBD, which is just as concerning for consumers who are spending a lot of money buying product, who in good faith, they think they are buying something that is going to help them, and then it has nothing in it. So we also know that there have been other research groups that have exposed this. We actually saw nationwide that there have been pockets of poisonings nationwide, so from Georgia to Utah and in our United States military. where they are buying CBD products and have some kind of negative reaction to it. So you might imagine I'm angry over this. I'm angry over what an unregulated industry is doing to consumers. And so I went on a big campaign as a scientist, right? I stepped out of my comfort zone and said, I'm going to go on some kind of public education campaign, and I'm going to end on the necessity for education. And so, I had the great fortune of Sanjay Gupta coming in, and his entire Weed 5 series was about the research in my lab and the unregulated industry. And so after we published that, all of this work, then we started getting phone calls and emails from all over the states from people saying, I purchased a product and I think I was poisoned. So you see from these products, they look like they don't look like sketchy products, right? We've got designed labels, we've got decent, they're in boxes, they look like they're tamper-proof, right? And so every single person that purchased one of these products went into a shop or bought it online wanting to have some kind of pharmaceutical benefit to what they were experiencing. So here are the results from all of those tests, right? These are CBD products that have been adulterated with a synthetic cannabinoid. So they were purchased for anxiety, they were purchased for joint pain, arthritis, and we had one person purchased to manage diabetic leg pain. And so you'll see some of their testimony on that. They bought in brick and mortar stores, they purchased online. The CBD products that were for joint pain and arthritis, these were women in their 70s. And so the woman who purchased CBD for arthritis, we combed, thinking we would find a synthetic cannabinoid, but it was a really, really strong concentrated THC product that she took. And so, the best that we can surmise is that potentially she had some kind of drug-drug interaction. But she definitely consumed a product that was 10 times what was on the label. So, the hemp boom is over. CBD is tanked in some regards, right? And so we've got stockpiles of hemp and CBD nationwide. Well, what do you do with all of that? Let's make something else. Let's call it Delta 8. So Delta 8 is a natural is a natural cannabinoid. It's in trace amounts in the plant naturally. The concentrations that we are seeing in products today is synthesized Delta 8. You cannot grow enough plant material and squeeze out enough natural Delta 8 to put it in the concentrations it's in these products. So what's concerning about Delta 8 is how it's manufactured. You put CBD in sulfuric acid, essentially battery acid, and you let it cook for 3 days. What you wind up at the end of 3 days is a balance of Delta 8 and Delta 9. So it's never a pure conversion. You get Delta 8 and Delta 9. So at the end of the 3 days, you then have to neutralize all that acid, so you've got to dump more chemicals into it. And then you have to purify it, and then you have to extract it with ether, and then you have something that you can potentially put into a product. So we are trusting people who are essentially being creative with chemistry to make sure that they're cleaning out all of these chemicals out of their products before they actually hit the market.
Mr. Chairman, quick question for the presenter.
Yes.
Dr. Peace, would that be a similar process for synthesis of any hemp product that you just described there for Delta 8? I'm trying to figure out if a cannabis plant produces cannabinoids naturally when grown out of the ground. When you say there's a synthesized cannabinoid, is this the process that results in the synthesizing of synthesized cannabis?
So the cannabinoids that are in the natural plant, those plants are processed to remove the natural cannabinoids from them in a process. So it's essentially, if you think about let's just talk about a wet paper towel. And so that's our natural plant. And so that wet paper towel, we want to be able to remove all of the water, so you just squeeze it. And so there's a chemical process involved that might facilitate that, but you're just removing the natural cannabinoids that already exist in the plant. And there's some processing involved in that. This is entirely synthetic. So they are taking a natural product and applying a chemical process to it to synthesize a new product. Now, that new product, granted, exists naturally in the plant, but in trace concentrations. This is a synthesized product. If you have to apply sulfuric acid to something and let it cook for 3 days, you are chemically changing that. So there's a difference between synthetic processed cannabinoids and processed cannabinoids that are natural.
Got it. That was very clear. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so now we have the rise of the analogs, right? So delta 9 THC, that's natural. Delta 8 THC, what's a little bit confounding by these products is this: it's just the difference of where a double bond is in the chemical itself. It's still going to interact at the CB1 receptor, and so it's just moving that double bond, right? It's similar in structure. Delta 10 is also a synthetic cannabinoid that was actually discovered when a lab making THC isolate accidentally dropped the fire extinguisher in the isolate. So here, synthetic process, a chemical reaction occurred. They tried to salvage all of the delta 9 and they discovered delta 10. Now there's a product called THCO. We talk a lot about delta 8, but I'm telling you what is coming up behind us is our other synthetic cannabinoids, THCO and THCP. If you were to believe what is anecdotally stated in drug user forums, is that THCO and THCP are more powerful synthetic cannabinoids than delta 9 THC is. So this is a case. This is THCO. We received a case. I cannot expose the details right now because it is still working through the court systems in some capacity. So this is a case, though, in which a person was taking a product because he was trying to stop smoking. And so this person committed an egregious crime. Egregious. And so he is now serving time for that, pled guilty to it. And so there are some concerns about his mental health while he's incarcerated. And his family wants him to actually have mental health support and treatment while he is incarcerated. So they said this is a man that never had any kind of mental health issues prior to this. So they send us products that they confiscated out of his apartment. And so we tested all of those, and I saw this, and I was like, oh, THC 0. So it's got to be a legal product. And so when I'm looking at the data, I'm like, this is not THC. This is, I don't know, what is this? This is THC acetate. And so this cannabinoid is anecdotally considered 300 times more hallucinogenic than THC. And so the young man believed that he was being controlled in a video game when he committed his crime. We know that the Michigan Poison Control Center has issued warnings about Delta 8 THC products. We also know that the American Association Poison Control Center is showing how calls into their control centers for CBD have gone up. This isn't necessarily because people are having problems with CBD. We believe a large portion of these cases are because these people have adulterated products. And so our concern is that when people have an adverse reaction, they need to be getting those products to somebody who can test them so that we can ferret out what is the difference between a reaction potentially to CBD, which we doubt is happening, to something with an adulterated product. So these are also products that we have tested in the lab. On the left, you see is a honey stick. The product was supposed to only have 45 milligrams of Delta-8 THC in it. The person who took this, and the reason why we got the second stick that he bought, was because he said, I took the entire stick, and I literally couldn't move for 4 hours. I had the worst hallucination I've ever had in my life. I wasn't even sure I had legs anymore. So this product had 953 milligrams of CBD in it, 204 milligrams of THC, and 631 milligrams of Delta-8. That's dangerous. So the CBD tincture was supposed to have 500 milligrams of CBD in it. It had a certificate from a lab. We found only 106. The gummies on the bottom were supposed to have 70 milligrams of CBD per gummy. We found 536 milligrams of CBD per gummy. This also had a certificate with it. We've received a number of other cases in. So we see here that we have a couple of products that actually still contained a residual solvent. We found cookies that were twice the amount of Delta-8 that was on the package. The cigarettes is not actually hemp material. It is shredded up paper that has been sprayed with something. And then the Trips Ahoy, what we believe is happening in this situation is that they're actually taking real products. You have some real products, right? Some of you probably have chips, right? And so they're taking the real product and spraying drug onto it. So in this situation, when we opened up the Trips Ahoy bag, it was still wet and sticky. And then when we broke the cookie apart to test it, hairs came out of it, right? And you can see the hair in that picture. Let me back up and talk about this. So what came out in the news in October was that a girl, 2-year-old, in Roanoke Valley accidentally ingested Delta-8. So we received that product. They believed that it was a Delta-8 product because it said Delta-8 on the bag. We actually analyzed this multiple times in my lab, and what we actually found was Delta-9, and it was highly, highly concentrated. A 2-year-old ate practically the entire bag.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, question.
Delia Brewer.
Dr. Pisa, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Are any of the companies that are having their logos ripped off, are there lawsuits? Do you know what's going on with that?
I don't know directly. We do know that that's, of course, a trademark infringement issue. And I don't know that they've been able to pursue that with much success. I don't know that they're chasing that at all. There are also other laws that could be considered in terms of essentially baiting children, with these kinds of products. So if the companies are not going to pursue the trademark infringement, then frankly, it probably becomes to the community or the family to press other kinds of charges in this situation. This is a vaping product that was brought to us. We don't know what is growing out of the mouthpiece. I have told my students, please don't open it until I'm present, because I don't know what it is. This is a pack of, it looks like you believe it to be gummies, Sour Patch gummies. It's actually plant material. This is a homemade cider. It had almost nothing in it. And these moon rocks were full of mold. Again, unregulated market. So in summary, we know that one of my stumps is that this issue around research as marketing really degrades public trust in the scientist. So we know that there are companies who will, right, they're not allowed to make health claims. And so what is happening in the unregulated market is that they can't make direct health claims, and we've seen letters from the FDA that has sent them a cease and desist order of making health claims. So what they do is they do a little bit of research. It's not done robustly. They get a little bit of results from it, and then they blog about it. That's fair game. And so here come the scientists, right? We're always 2 to 3 years behind the curve, waving our spreadsheets and our data packs and saying, I finally have science to back any of this up. And now the public is already out there saying, but I saw on a blog a couple of years ago. And so it generally degrades public trust. And so one of the things I always advocate for is the ability to have access to funding to be able to pursue robust clinical and research designs that are statistically valid. The other piece that I feel very strongly about is that we have to have enforcement against illicit products. The Delta 8 that is being sold, that is a synthetic cannabinoid. It's illicit. And so I feel strongly that we have to have enforcement. Now, the concern about that, and certainly for you to consider, is that law enforcement is confused about this. And so there has to be a great deal of education to our law enforcement communities, to prosecutors and defense attorneys, and to our judges with regards to what are these products, what is illicit. We need clarity. They need clarity. The third thing is that consumers have said we want cannabis. And so that being the case, I believe that we have to follow up with robust regulations for medical and the adult use retail market. That has to get defined quickly. I had a colleague of mine tell me we can't eat the elephant all in the one day, but I feel strongly about if we don't try to break off as much as we can quickly with the benefit of other states behind us informing us that if we have major gaps in the regulatory language and in the legislative language, then there are spaces for illicit and nefarious behavior. Robust regulations also require enforcement. So we have to have enough money and resources funneled into these agencies to actually enforce the regulations that they're going to put forth. And the last thing that I'm so passionate about, and I'm sure all of you are as well, is that we have to educate the public. We have to figure out clever ways for them to own this information because companies are already out ahead of us. And so what do we do to make the public empowered with the right information in a way that they can continue to support the rest of their communities? So on that note, thank you for your time, and I am,
I think we have
a few minutes left.
I think we have at least one more question.
One more question?
Yeah, Delegate Wampler.
Thank you, Dr. Peace. This was very informative. Specifically on the synthesized cannabinoid area of this larger discussion. With proper testing and analysis of the goods that are being sold in the Commonwealth that are hemp-derived products, could we provide for that testing, do you think, in your opinion, for those types of products sold in the Commonwealth?
Yes. I think that the infrastructure that exists that supports the medical program can also receive those samples from people who are producing the hemp-based, CBD-based products as well. Right. So, yes, the quality assurance third-party independent testing system does exist.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out my next question. Mr. Chairman, can I have another?
Yes, absolutely. We have at least 5 more minutes.
So with quality control testing, these synthetic cannabinoids, there is a level where they would be okay for human consumption, but what the real problem is that we have unregulated, untested, and unlicensed hemp products that have 500 milligrams of whatever additive that, and it can vary, of course, because we don't know, but is there an acceptable level, or in your experience, it's not that all synthesized cannabinoids are terrible for human health. It's just that uncontrolled and untested, they pose a real risk to the citizens of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I think what is very, very difficult about getting to that, right? Everybody wants to say, well, how much can you take? Is that there's just not enough scientific study, clinical studies, to really demonstrate that. Because we've not been able to conduct these studies, as Dr. Hustis said, on humans, particularly with synthetic cannabinoids because of the federal restrictions. So knowing what that number could be is right now impossible to know.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one last question.
Delegate Wampler.
Let me think of the best way to word this. So let's say these are already on the market, but let's say they're controlled and regulated by Virginia. What are the things that we should be looking for as legislators and potentially the Cannabis Control Authority to test for with synthetics in your experience and extensive testing with your lab?
Sure.
What are the typical additives or typical chemical compounds that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so one of the things that is really difficult, right? So there are more than 800 synthetic cannabinoids that we know of. And some of those are going to be more popular than others. Right now, you know, the world is screaming to us about Delta 8. And so what laboratories will need to do is develop a panel where they can tell the difference between a synthetic cannabinoid and the natural one. So like in my research lab and at Cardinal Quality Laboratories, right now we're the only lab in Virginia that's in the quality assurance third-party independent tested that has what we call an untargeted analysis. And this comes out of our experience. Me and my colleagues are all forensic scientists, and we saw a desperate need in the Commonwealth to where we needed to fill that space with expertise because we saw what was happening on the forensic science side of the house. And so we took that skill set and have brought it into our laboratory, Cardinal Quality Laboratories, and so we offer untargeted analyses. These are inherently incredibly difficult to do without experience. And so while my colleagues that operate other third-party independent labs, can certainly stand up the analysis, interpreting that data requires years of experience, and particularly years of experience in evaluating synthetic cannabinoids. So the point is that it's really difficult. It requires a lot of experience. It requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of instrumentation. And so is there a way to do it? Yes. Is everyone going to select to do that? Maybe not.
Thank you, Dr. Peace.
Anyone else from the committee have a question? Delegate Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Peace, in response to one of Delegate Wampler's questions, you suggested that one of the problems is that there's no ability to be able to test domestically because of the federal limitations here.
To conduct scientific research and clinical studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is sold around the world, however. Are you aware if there have been any international studies of that type conducted?
Yeah, so we do know that there are colleagues in, say, Israel who have conducted research, but a lot of the focus has been on just trying to figure out Delta 9, right? And so, trying to understand how Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol works, what are its therapeutic benefits, and what are the issues with its consumption, consumes a lot of time and effort worldwide. What we know is lacking is a lot of research on these synthetic cannabinoids in terms of defining how potent are they, how efficacious are they. There's some research that's done, but not a lot.
Anyone else have any questions? I have a quick question, and
Yes, sir.
I think I may know, but the danger I think we sometimes have as legislators is maybe assuming we know the answers. So we should better go ahead and ask it, and that is, of all the other states in the U.S. who have legalized cannabis, have any of those states been successful in weeding out the synthetics from the market?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. The first piece is that we have some understanding. So Delta 8 really only emerged in the spring. So like around April, at least when it hit the forensic scientist radar. And so we saw its emergence in states that did not have adult use legal retail markets. So that's where we saw Delta 8 really penetrate, was where there wasn't access. In terms of have other states been able to control the state of synthetic cannabinoids? Synthetic cannabinoids they're their own beast. And so, people who want to have that kind of experience are going to search for that kind of an experience. They want to purchase Spice. They want to purchase K2. And so those products are going to exist in all states because it's just difficult to completely squash the demand for novel psychoactive substances.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I want to thank the committee for spending so much time this evening being educated on this subject matter. I also want to thank the clerk and the clerk staff and IT for the late night that we made them endure this evening. Again, thank you to the entire panel for taking your time to present and sticking around and watching the other presentations and all the preparatory work that went into making your presentation. We hope to stay in touch, and if you see that we can be benefited from your guidance in the future, please feel free to interject yourself. And for anyone else out there who has been watching this presentation live stream who did not present, we also welcome your input, and you know how to reach us. Dr. Eustis, I see your hand up. Do you have a question or comment?
I actually have a really strong comment, and Dr. Peace and I are both in the same area. So I want to tell you that at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I ran many controlled drug administration studies with MDMA and cannabis and cocaine and everything. And I tried for 8 years and to run a study on synthetic cannabinoids because so many police chiefs and judges and everyone else wrote to me and said, how can we prosecute these cases? How can we do anything if we can't characterize the pharmacology? And no matter what I did with my whole track record at NIDA and with the FDA and the DEA, we never could do it. So that's one of the problems is we can't study it and learn about all of its adverse effects. And yet the guinea pigs are our children and colleagues and friends who order it over the internet. It comes right through. It's very difficult for customs to get it because it comes in small vials right to your doorstep. So that's a huge issue. And then the issue about whether other states have been able to eliminate it that Dr. Peace was discussing. The laboratories making Delta 8 are actually challenging the Drug Enforcement Agency and saying that, oh no, this is legal because it came from hemp and the Farm Bill protects us. Now, none of us believe that, but unfortunately, that's the situation we're in now. And it's not going to get better, as Dr. Peace showed you. There's just more analogs. That's the whole novel psychoactive things is change one molecule and then maybe you can say it's legal. So it's a huge problem. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks again for everybody for attending.